Welcome to part 2 of the Workbench build series. If you missed the first video, there's a link to it in the description below. But to catch everybody up, last video we started off with some lumber and then built the shell of the workbench and then added some functional storage shelving to the unit. Today we're going to continue building out that functionality by adding in some power outlets to the table and then building out the French cleat holsters on either side for a butcher paper roll as well as a table saw so you can use the whole table as an outfeed. If you want to see how I did it, stick around and I'll show you how. To add the electrical outlets to the workbench, I started off by taking a 20-foot extension cord and cutting off the power plug on the end. I fed those wires into a J-box and spliced it into some traditional home wiring, and then used that to daisy chain into the other two power outlets that are used on the workbench. This is more of a woodworking channel, so I don't want to focus too much on the electrical. I don't profess to be any sort of an expert, but I know enough to be dangerous. So I'm just showing you enough here to actually visualize what I did and how I wired everything up. You'll notice in this video that I actually over-hammered the single gang box to the workbench leg. So whenever I went to put on the faceplate, it actually didn't fit. So I had to come back through with the hammer and kind of loosen it up a little bit to get the faceplate to fit correctly. Once the first outlet was wired up, I daisy chained that to wire up a similar outlet on the other side of the table, and I used some cable clips on the underside of the table just to make sure that they were out of harm's way and that they were neatly tucked on the underside of the table. One thing I want to emphasize here is as I was going through this process, I did not have the extension cord plugged in. If you're going to do any electrical work, make sure you've got good energy isolation and you're not putting yourself in harm's way. Once both outlets were wired up, I took some time to do some cable management for the extension cord that was going to be running across the shop floor by covering it in duct tape, and then I ran it along the underside of the drywall to keep it out of sight as much as possible. And then I ran it behind my dust collection system all the way up to the outlet, which is actually placed above my sprinkler system. Next, I set out to create a holder for the butcher paper on the French cleat system. I did this by starting with a scrap piece of wood and tracing a stencil of the shape that I wanted for the holder. I decided to go with the 1-inch hole since that's the size of the dowel that's going to be used to hold the roll whenever this is finished. So once I had my lines drawn, I started out by drilling a 1-inch hole using a paddle bit, and then I used a combination of a table saw and a hand saw to cut those lines and to actually create the template. I then used that same template on a new piece of scrap wood to create the second piece, so I had two identical pieces to hold both sides of the dowel. After both pieces were cut out, they were attached to a wider base plate so that whenever the French cleat system is hung off the edge of the table, it's got a little bit more of a stable footprint for lateral support. Now you'll notice here that I'm assembling this system using a combination of wood glue and brad nails because there's not going to be a whole lot of weight or stress added to this particular attachment. So reinforcing with wood screws wasn't needed in this case. Now I'm pausing here to emphasize the spacing between the top cleat and the bottom spacer. And that's driven largely from the table saw system, which has a much higher spacing requirement for that particular French cleat system. So this is being spaced out to emulate what's needed for that particular French cleat spacing. It's not needed here, but in order to make the system work, this is the spacing that we had to go with. With both sides of the French cleat system installed, I was able to drop the dowel along with the butcher paper in the system just to get an idea for spacing. Once I had those measurements, I went ahead and cut the dowel and then added some lateral crossbeam support so that you can actually move this entire butcher paper attachment as a single piece. So you'll notice some added lateral supports here. And if you're going to be using the downdraft table, you can just take this and rest it on the French cleat wall whenever you're not using it. That way it's out of sight. And now you've got the end of the workshop bench that you can use. So you can use for the downdraft table. You can have easy access to the power right here. And this French cleat doesn't really get in your way. Next, I turned my attention to the table saw that was going to be hung off of the French cleat system. The idea being that you can use the entire workbench as an outfeed table whenever you need to. So I started off by cutting out a base that was going to be used to hold the actual table saw itself, and using some pretty sturdy 2x4s to actually reinforce to provide a little bit more strength and rigidity to the system. So you'll see me use a combination of wood glue and brad nails to get it held temporarily, but I come back later and reinforce it with wood screws to make sure that it has enough strength to be able to withhold the weight of the table saw. Additionally, I'm going to come back once those 2x4 supports are in place and put some 3/4 inch plywood sheathing on the side, again, just to give a little bit more lateral support and a little bit more rigidity. One small issue I encountered as I was dry fitting one of the side sheathing pieces is the clearance fit of the sliding fence mechanism on my job site table saw. It was just 1/4 inch too high, so I had to go back and shave a little bit more off, and then everything worked fine. Once the side sheathing pieces were done, I turned my attention to the back sheathing piece. I traced and cut a square opening on the back side to allow a 4-inch dust collection port to come through. This will be used later whenever I hook up my dust collection system to the table saw so that I can use it inside without getting dust all over my workshop. Once I cut the opening with the jigsaw, I just came back and sanded it real quick with 120 grit sandpaper. Once all the sheathing pieces were done, I did a quick dry fit just to make sure everything worked and that I wouldn't have any access issues once it was finally assembled. Then I began the glue up process using some Tight Bond 3 wood glue and a little bit of brad nailing just to hold it in place. This is just temporary because I come back later and actually reinforced with some wood screws just to give it a little bit more strength. Now you'll notice as I screw in the wood screws that I'm not countersinking them or spending too much time aligning the spacing or the alignment of the screws. This is just personal preference. Given that this is just going to be a tool in my shop, I'm not taking the time to do that. But you could if you wanted to spend that much attention to detail. Well, my camera died while I was filming the last segment, so I had to go ahead and finish the table saw section up off camera. But if you look at the final product, it worked out pretty well. So I've got the table saw mounted in this wooden container that is actually able to be hung on a French cleat. And if you look closely, you can see a little spacer down there with the support. I actually had to put in some additional support right here so it had something to adhere to. Otherwise it would kind of bend in on itself. So this keeps it straight. And if I take a level, this took a lot of preparation, but you can see that the table saw is just higher than the actual table itself. So you're not gonna have any issues of the wood that you're cutting catching on the actual workbench whenever you use it as an outfeed table. So really happy with how it turned out. I'll also plan on installing the same French cleat system on this side as well, because if you look at how close this table saw is to the wall, if you had anything big like full sheets of plywood or any kind of long dimensional lumber that you were trying to cut, the wall would get in the way. So I need to have the same system on both sides. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that right now, but pretty happy with how this turned out. Here's the final product. You can see the table saw off to the right. You've got cabinetry down here for the sliding containers. I've got the planer on this side, a spare dust collection hose over here. And if I squat down in the back, you can see there's the planer. And then you can also see the blue dust collection hose coming into the back of the table saw. This table saw is resting on a French cleat that's along the side of the workbench. You've got power wired up right here. And if I swing around to the other side, there's a similar French cleat system on this side for the paper roller. There's another power outlet on this side. I've got a shop vac under here for any kind of small tools or any kind of a shop cleanup that I want to do. And that's the workbench. I'm really excited to have this capability in my shop so that I don't have to step outside into the driveway every time I want to cut something. I now have all of my tools organized with a good working space and a dust collection system to where I can run my table saw inside the garage. So if you like this content, give it a like and a subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.